We're going to get started with our keynote now. Keynotes, plural. But first, I think it does some honor to think about where the money that's paying for all of this is coming from. Frederick Ewan has a lecture series named after him in honor of academic freedom and civil liberties because he was a professor here during the Red Scare. And they tried to silence his voice and free speech within this space, and police the kinds of conversations we could not have. To ensure that that doesn't happen, and that there is a space for us to have these conversations, even when they're hard or challenging, there is a fund, hopefully, in perpetuity, and we're benefiting from that, all of us. And so, in honor of, I just want us to think for a moment about why we're doing this. That's part of the reason. I'm now going to turn over to our moderator of our paired keynotes, to Gunja SenGupta. She's the chair of the history department here, an expert on slavery in its global context. And she will introduce our speakers individually.
All right, so welcome to this keynote panel featuring two incredibly exciting, distinguished speakers who will take us to very different times and places in the course of our search for the meanings and experiences of slavery and freedom, right? But I think we'll be able to find some common ground. I'm really looking forward to the discussion segment. So here's what I thought we might do. Let me introduce both of you, and then have you make your presentations. And then perhaps I can ask you a question to start us off, and then we'll leave the floor open to further questions. So our first speaker is Professor Deborah Kamen. She's an associate professor of classics at Washington University and an adjunct in gender, women, and sexuality studies as well. So she specializes in Greek cultural and social history with a particular focus on slavery. Her book, Status in Classical Athens, was published by Princeton University Press in 2013, and it, quote, maps a spectrum of 10 social and legal statuses in classical Athens, questioning the ideology of three neatly defined status groups: slave, metic, and citizen, so commonly found in both Greek literature and modern classical scholarship. And I think that opens up all kinds of amazing possibilities. Yes, I can't wait for us to talk about this. In addition to Greek history, Professor Kamen has written extensively on Roman sexuality and serves as co-chair of the Lambda Classical Caucus, which is a coalition of queer classicists and their allies affiliated with the Society for Classical Studies. Professor Kamen will speak on slavery, freedom, and sexual obligation in ancient Greece. She will be followed by Professor Sadia Hartman, who is a professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University. Her scholarly interests lie in African American and American literature, cultural history, slavery, law and literature, and performance studies. She is a highly decorated scholar, having won numerous awards, including the Fulbright and Rockefeller. She is the author of works that I use quite regularly in my 19th century US classes, namely Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America, and Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route. In addition, she has published on photography, feminism, and film, and she's beginning a new project on photography and ethics. The title of Professor Hartman's talk is An Intimate History of Slavery and Freedom. So I give you Professor Kamen.
Thank you so so much for the introduction, and I'd like to thank Lee, Vera, and all of the organizers for this conference, which has already been incredibly stimulating and interesting to me. In ancient Greece, as in most slaveholding societies, the sexual exploitation of slaves was commonplace. What I'd like to explore in this talk is some of the ways in which slaves in Greece could use sex to acquire their freedom, even if that freedom was often compromised by the continued payment of sex. There is a handout. If anyone doesn't have it, raise your hand and one can be circulated. That seems everyone has it. Okay. Now, the connection between sex and manumission is, of course, not unique to Greece. The relationship between the two has been studied in ancient Rome, for example, by Matthew Perry, and cross-culturally by Orlando Patterson, among others. I also want to stress that I in no way want to romanticize sexual relations between free men and slaves in Greece. Free men exercised complete domination over slaves' bodies, and slaves had absolutely no right to resist. For us to even insinuate that these relationships were affectionate or mutual only perpetuates what my co-keynote speaker, Saidiya Hartman, calls the rhetoric of seduction. That is, the discourse of alleged intimacy that allows for the perpetuation of sexual violence against slaves. Now, before I go any further, I'd first like to explain how manumission operated in ancient Greece. There was, crucially, never an emancipation of slaves in Greece, but individual masters could acquire, or rather individual slaves could acquire their freedom in a variety of ways. A master might simply choose to manumit one or more of his slaves, something he was most likely to do on his deathbed or in a will, as opposed to during his lifetime. Now, in some slave societies, including ancient Rome, slaves can purchase their own freedom. It comes back to this idea of owning yourself, right? Slaves can purchase their own freedom, but this was not the case in ancient Greece, where slaves lacked the legal right to own or spend money. They could, however, have their freedom purchased by a third party, or in some cases, they could make a non-monetary payment in exchange for their freedom. Also worth noting is that manumission in Greece could be either conditional or unconditional, a distinction we also find, for example, in colonial Brazil. Unconditional manumission entailed freedom without any strings attached, whereas conditional manumission obligated the slave to remain and perform certain services before attaining complete freedom. Now, in Greek, this obligation is often referred to with the Greek verb parameno, which means to remain beside, or with the related noun paramone, remaining beside. Now, regardless of whether a slave was freed conditionally or unconditionally, it's important to note that slaves in Greece did not become citizens. Instead, they occupied a status somewhere between slave and citizen. Now, in this talk, I want to explore 3 ways in which slaves pay the sexual cost of freedom. Now, one of these ways was by engaging in sexual relations with one's own master, or perhaps more accurately, being the victim of a master's sexual advances. However, sex in itself was not usually sufficient to ensure one's freedom. Manumission was more likely if sex resulted in a child or children that the master wanted to recognize as his own. A second way of acquiring freedom through sex was by somehow attracting the interest of a man who was not one's own master. In such cases, a man driven by love or lust might pay for a desired slave's freedom in order to obtain either exclusive sexual access, in the case of slave prostitutes, or sexual access at all, since it wasn't permitted to have sex with somebody else's slave. And finally, a third way of paying the sexual cost of freedom was by bearing children, whether to one's master or to another slave, with the express purpose of providing a slave replacement for oneself, and thereby gaining one's own freedom. So let's begin by looking at sex with one's own master. Domestic slaves in Greece, living under the same roofs as their masters, were readily available and therefore easy targets. And in fact, we find scattered references in Greek literature to men either in love with or more often lust with their domestic slaves. We hear about them kissing and groping their slaves when their wives are not present. A character in one dialogue says, this is handout 1A, "Don't many Athenian men have sex with their maidservants, some of them secretly, but others quite openly?" Now, while the language used for sex here and elsewhere is relatively benign, implying intercourse rather than rape, there is one telling passage, which I provided as handout 1B, in which a man says that an attractive wife can, believe it or not, be more arousing than a slave, especially when the wife provides sex willingly, whereas slaves provide sexual services only under compulsion. Now, in some cases, though far from all, men might set free or promise the future freedom of a domestic slave with whom they were having a sexual relationship. These women, now technically legally free, would then generally stay on in the household as the man's concubine, in a sense providing the very same sexual services that contributed to their manumission in the first place. And it's maybe what we see happening in Menander's comedy, The Hated Man, this is handout 1C, in which a soldier says about a girl who'd been captured in war, quote, "I bought her, granted her her freedom, made her my housekeeper, gave her servants, jewelry, and clothes, considered her my wife," end quote. So this girl is granted social mobility, to be sure, but she is also expected to provide sex, willingly or otherwise, as the soldier's concubine. At this point in Athenian history, when this play is set, male citizens could have non-citizen concubines, but not non-citizen wives. Okay, so you couldn't marry a non-citizen. Note that this soldier thinks of her as his wife, but she isn't legally his wife. Now, sometimes the manumission of a domestic slave happened after she bore her master's child. Admittedly, our evidence rarely discloses why a given slave is being freed, but at least in circumstances where we find a slave woman being manumitted along with her slave children, and the children are either explicitly or implicitly said to be born to the master, in those circumstances we can speculate that a sexual relationship between master and slave underlies the manumission. So a relatively clear-cut example can be found in a will from Greco-Roman Egypt. This is handout 1D. In this will, a man sets free a slave woman named Melinus and her son Ammonius, quote, "born from me." However, the manumission itself would only take effect once the man died. Between the writing of the will and his death, Melinus was presumably expected to provide continued sexual service to her master. Most other cases are less explicit about the relationship between master, domestic slave, and offspring, but I believe it's possible in some instances to read between the lines. So for example, handout 1E is part of a manumission inscription from the Greek city of Delphi. It reads as follows, quote, this is handout 1E. Agamestor, son of Telestos, sold to Pythian Apollo, which is the name for the god Apollo. On these terms, a female slave whose name was Zocura, of Thracian stock, and two male slaves whose names were Agamestor and Telestos, of homeborn stock, for a price of 7 minas of silver. Since Zocura, Agamestor, and Telestos entrusted the sale to the god in order that they be free and untouchable for their entire lives, remaining by, this is the verb that I mentioned, parameno, remaining by Agamestor as long as he lives. So first, let's establish what's going on here. A man named Agamestor appears to be selling to the god Apollo a female slave, as well as 2 male homeborn slaves. But he does so, quote, in order that they be free, meaning that the ultimate aim of this transaction is in fact manumission, not genuine sale to the god. And for this reason, scholars, including myself, have conventionally interpreted this type of transaction as a fictive sale, since the new owner, the god Apollo, makes no use of his right of ownership. Now in this case that we're looking at here, the slave's freedom is conditional, since they are required to remain by their former master until his death. Now, for our purposes, what's especially interesting in this inscription is the names of the two homeborn slaves, Agamestor and Telestas. You'll notice that they have the same names as their master and their master's father, respectively. Now, since passing down family names like this is how free people in Greece name their children, not how masters generally name their slaves, I think it's reasonable to suppose that these boys are the sons of Agamestor. I think we can speculate as well that they were born from a sexual union with Zopura, the female slave, while she was still a slave. Now, all three slaves, Zopura, Agamestor Jr., we can call him, and Telestas, are to remain with Agamestor in Paramone, this kind of remaining obligation. They're to remain with him in Paramone after the quote-unquote sale, as long as Agamestor lives, with Zopura presumably serving as Agamestor's concubine in the meantime. Now, if my reconstruction of events is correct, Zopura's sexual relationship with her master, as well as the children issuing from this relationship, both of these were a factor in her manumission, not to mention the manumission of her children. A similar situation may underlie another set of inscriptions from the city of Delphi. The first of these inscriptions is handout 1F. We read the following. Quote, Cleomantus, son of Dinon, dedicates the sale of his female slave Isius on the condition of freedom at a price of 2 minas, and let Isius remain by Cleomantus the whole time of his life, doing everything ordered like a slave. Now, the process here is a little different than we saw in the last description. Rather than quote-unquote selling his slave to Apollo, Cleomantus dedicates the sale to the god, but he does so on the same condition, namely that the slave, here Isius, provide Paramone service, as long as her master lives, at which point she receives her full freedom. Now, we're given no indication here of why Isius has been promised her freedom, but a presumably later inscription, this is handout 1G, may provide a clue. So this inscription reads, Cleomantus, son of Dinon, released his own female fosterling slave, Isius, from Paramone, and I, Cleomantus, hold the money that was written down in the Paramone agreement and release the son Nicostratus, born to her during Paramone, whom she will also call Cleomantus, having changed his name in order that they be free in every honorable way and belonging to no one at all in any manner. And whenever Cleomantus should suffer something mortal, that is when he dies, let everything left behind by him be for Sosula, who is presumably his wife, for her use. And if Sosula suffers anything, let everything be Isius's and Cleomantus Jr.'s, and let them belong to no one else in any way. End quote. Now, assuming these are the same Cleomantus and Isius we saw on handout 1F, I think they are, what we find here is Cleomantus granting Isius early release from Paramone service and manumitting the son born to her during her period of Paramone. And not only that, but Cleomantus has Isius change the boy's name from Nicostratus to his own name, Cleomantus, and he designates Isius and the boy as his heirs in the event of his wife Sosula's death. And once again, it does not seem to me to be a stretch to suppose that Cleomantus Jr. was the son of Isius and Cleomantus, and the boy's name was changed once his father, master, acknowledged his paternity. In this case, the sexual relationship between Isius and Cleomantus, and in particular Cleomantus's desire to have an heir, both of these factors provided the grounds for granting Isius early release from Paramone, and therefore full freedom. Now, in the examples we've looked at so far, the mother's manumission coincides with the manumission of her slave children. In a handful of other inscriptions, it specified only that a domestic slave's children are manumitted, with no indication of whether their mother has also been freed. So an inscription from the Greek city of Kyrene, this is handout 1H, records that, quote, Xenophontos dedicates as sacred to the god Serapis a young slave named Demetrios, born to him from his female fosterling slave. Now, the purpose of this dedication, like that of the fictive sales I described earlier, The purpose was to set free the slave in question, namely the son of Xenophontos with his domestic slave. Another inscription, this handout 1I, a bronze tablet from the Greek city of Olympia, reads in part, quote, Agesilaus set free probably his children, born from Sphinga as sacred to Olympian Zeus, and Pitho, daughter of Abydos, gave her approval. And then we have a whole list of names. In light of the other inscriptions that we've been looking at, it's pretty safe to assume that Sphinga's children were fathered by Agesilaus. And this Pitho who's mentioned may be Agesilaus' wife, the Pitho who gives her approval. If it is his wife, it's kind of striking that she's giving her consent to the manumission of her husband's children born extramaritally to a slave. Now, in both of these inscriptions, it's unclear whether the mothers, so Democritus' mother in handout 1H, Sphinga in handout 1I, it's unclear whether these mothers were also freed, whether they remained slaves, or even whether they had died. We just have no way of knowing. So we've seen thus far that sexual relations with one's master, as truly awful as they must have been, had at least the potential to contribute to a slave's freedom, especially when these relations resulted in the birth of a child. Another path to attaining freedom was through attracting the sexual interest of a man who is not one's own master. Now, a man who found himself attracted to someone else's slave had a couple of options. Assuming that her master was willing, he could either pay for the slave's freedom, or he could buy her to be his own slave. Though the latter path, buying her to be his own slave, guaranteed him exclusive rights over her as his property, there were nonetheless some advantages to paying for her freedom. For one, their relationship would have greater respectability. Concubinage, which could be done only with a free person, not with a slave, concubinage was a recognized form of non-marital partnership in Greece, usually, though not always, a kind of exclusive relationship. Secondly, if a woman was freed, any children born to her as a concubine would automatically be free rather than slave. So that's another advantage. And thirdly, with a free woman, unlike a slave, one could at least pretend that she was offering up sexual services freely and willingly. Now, it was usually slave prostitutes whose freedom was secured in this way. I should note that there were basically two main types of prostitute in Greece, although the distinction between the two may have been more ideological than real. There was the porne, from which you get things like pornography, the porne, who's basically a streetwalker or brothel prostitute, and then there's the higher status, though still often slave or freed slave, hetaira, who provided companionship and intellectual stimulation, as well as sex. There were, in addition, slave musicians who performed at drinking parties and also provided sexual services. Now, it was usually hetairae, the higher status prostitutes, who managed to obtain their freedom, but occasionally we catch glimpses of the lower status porni being manumitted as well. As we'll see, it was generally past or present clients who put up the money for the freedom of these prostitutes. It's possible that some did so out of a generosity rooted in affection, but in most cases it was because of a more selfish desire to keep these women for themselves as free concubines. So this kind of arrangement, helping a prostitute become free in order to make her one's concubine, is suggested in a few lines from a comedy by Aristophanes. This is handout 2A. So in this comedy, an old man says to a flute-playing slave girl, quote, "If you are not a bad woman to me now, when my son dies, I'll keep you as my concubine, my little piggy, having had you released." Now, yeah, what's funny here, if it is, what's funny here in the context of the play is that the old man is acting just like a young man. And it's usually a young man who says he'll do something crazy like, pay for a prostitute when his father's died, not a father saying once his son has died. But for our purposes, what's interesting is that the old man hopes that the mere offer of future freedom will be enough to convince the girl to grant sexual services, perhaps even for free. However, if he were to deliver on his promise, something he has no intention of doing, we should note that along with the girl's freedom would come the obligation of lifelong sexual service as a kept woman. Apart from comedy like this, our best evidence for the practice of prostitutes securing their freedom in exchange, implicitly or explicitly, for sex comes from classical Athenian courtroom speeches. So in a lawsuit called Against Neaira, this is handout 2B, it's a lawsuit brought by a man named Apollodorus. In this lawsuit, a freed slave Hetaira named Neaira is accused of posing illegally as a citizen in Athens in order to secure citizenship for her children. At this time in classical Athens, mothers, in addition to fathers, had to be citizens in order for their children to be citizens. Now, according to Apollodorus, who's bringing the suit, two of Neaira's clients decided to purchase her from her madam as their shared sex slave for the price of 30 minas. And this is, I should point out, this is a really high price for a slave. 1 mina is roughly equivalent to 2 to 3 months' pay for a skilled workman. Most slaves are purchased for 1 to 3 minas. She was purchased for 30. After some time passed, the two men offered Neaira her freedom if she could somehow supply them with 20 minas, 10 less than her purchase price. Eager to be free, she collected this money from a number of apparently more than willing present and former clients, adding a little of her own money to the mix, and she persuaded one of these clients, a man named Phrynion, to hand over the money to her owners, thereby making her free. She then moved in with this guy Phrynion, but when he became abusive, she left town, resumed working as a prostitute, and ultimately selected another of her clients as her patron. Now, after Phrynion tried to claim her back as his slave, he, Phrynion, and Neaira's new patron arrived at a compromise whereby Neaira, though technically still free, was to split her time between their two homes, presumably owing sexual services to both of them as a concubine of sorts. In other contexts, we find men reprimanded for spending money, often lots of money, to secure the freedom of their favorite slave prostitutes. So, for example, in one court case, this is handout 2C, the plaintiff attacks the defendant's character in the following way. Quote, "This Olympiodorus, man of the jury, has never married an Athenian citizen woman in accordance with your laws, nor has he any children, nor has he ever had any, but having had her Hetaira released, that is, having paid for her freedom, he keeps her in his house, presumably as a concubine, expected to provide continued sexual services, either implicitly or explicitly in exchange for her freedom." In a similar fashion, handout 2D, we learn that the Athenian politician Hyperides was criticized because he, quote, "took up with Myrrhine, the expensive Hetaira, and he kept her in the city, that is in Athens, and in the Piraeus, another part of the near Athens. In the Piraeus, he kept Aristagora, and on Eleusis, he kept Phila, whom he freed, having purchased her for a very large sum of money, and later he even made her his homemaker." And we have no way of knowing whether Hyperides also paid for the freedom of these other two Hetaira who are mentioned, as he clearly did Phila, but the fact that he kept these women, each in a different town, implies that they were likely his freed slave concubines. Other evidence for slave prostitutes securing their freedom may be found once again in the manumission inscriptions. So part of one such inscription, this is handout 2E, reads as follows. "Dionysia sold to Pythian Apollo on these terms 2 male children slaves whose names were Andro and Theopompus of homeborn stock, and another girl whose name was Aphrodisia of homeborn stock, and another female whose name was Euemeria of homeborn stock, for a price of 20 minas of silver. Dionysia holds the payment whole, since Andro and Theopompus and Aphrodisia and Euemeria entrusted the sale to the gods. Let Andron and Theopompus and Aphrodisia and Euemeria remain by the side of Dionysia as long as she lives, and let them do intrepidly everything that has been ordered. And let Aphrodisia and Euemeria work for Dionysia from their bodies and in whatever other way." Now the verb here ergadzestone, from the verb ergadzomai. It means to work, but it's often used to denote sexual work, sexual labor, especially when coupled with the phrase from one's body, or with one's body. So for this reason, I think it's likely that Aphrodisia and Euemeria, whose names mean something like sexual pleasures and beautiful bay, respectively, I think it's likely that these women were prostitutes providing sexual labor for their Madame Dionysia, both before and after their quote-unquote sale. We might speculate then that Aphrodisia and Euemeria were able to afford the price of their manumission from their earnings as prostitutes, or perhaps more likely through a donation from current or past clients, or from a combination of the two. Now, whether or not a given man intended to keep for sexual purposes a prostitute whose freedom he helped to secure, one reason he might have paid for her freedom, at least in the case of female slaves, was if she was thought to be carrying his child, a motivation we've already seen in the case of masters and domestic slaves. In fact, Greek literature reveals an anxiety that prostitutes might use pregnancy as a pretext for attaining their freedom. In extreme cases, even trying to pass off someone else's child as their own. So in Menander's comedy, The Arbitrators, an abandoned baby is found, and a hetaira named Habratonon hatches the idea of lying to her client, a man named Chrysios, lying and saying that she is the baby's mother. And that, of course, Chrysios is the father. Now, she mentions this plan to one of Chrysios' slaves, who says, this is handout 2F, the slave says, if Chrysios thinks you're the mother of his child, he'll surely release you at once. This delights Habratonon, who says, quote, gods, I wish only to be free. I wish to take this as a reward from these things. That is, Habratonon knowingly and deceptively harnesses her potential for reproduction in the service of being freed, even if in the end her plot doesn't quite work out. Now, thus far, I've discussed a number of examples of prostitutes whose freedom was facilitated by interested third parties. But it was not only prostitutes who were freed in this way. Sometimes we hear about besotted men paying for the freedom of other men's domestic slaves. Our best example of this actually involves a slave boy, and this shouldn't necessarily surprise us, since in Greece, attractive slave boys, just like attractive free boys, were the objects of men's desire. However, the freeing of male slaves for sexual reasons is attested considerably less often than that of female slaves, probably for a couple of reasons. A boy could not be a proper concubine. There was no concept of male concubinage per se. And a sexual relationship would have been socially acceptable only as long as the boy was young, say under the age of 18. An investment in the boy's manumission would therefore have been less worthwhile, at least economically. Moreover, slave boys, to state the obvious, cannot get pregnant, and as we've seen and we'll see again, pregnancy, at least sometimes, furnished the grounds for manumission. Nonetheless, despite these factors, men occasionally paid or tried to pay for the freedom of slave boys whom they loved or lusted after. And just as with female slave prostitutes, there was an expectation that these boys would perform sexual services even after their manumission. It's kind of the whole point. So let's look, for example, at another lawsuit. This is handout 2G, the lawsuit against Athenagenes, a charge of fraud brought against a man named Athenagenes by a man named Hippocrates. The backstory here is that Hippocrates, desperate to have sex with one of the slave boys of Athenagenes, asked Athenagenes if he could purchase the boy's freedom. Athenagenes, seizing the opportunity to make a profit, devised a way to swindle Hippocrates. He sent the slave boy to Hippocrates, instructing the boy to say that his master would free him only if Hippocrates bought the freedom of the boy's father and brother as well. Hippocrates, who's completely driven by lust, agrees to this deal. Now, Hippocrates offers to pay for these slaves to become free, pay for their freedom. But Athenagenes claimed he had a better idea. He urged Hippocrates first to buy the slaves outright, to buy them as slaves, rather than purchase their freedom, and then, at some later point, to set them free, saying that in this way the slaves would be more grateful to Epicrates since he would be their manumitter. So Epicrates takes Athenagenes up on his offer, not realizing that Athenagenes has motivations that are not quite pure. The truth is that these slaves were saddled with substantive debts accrued in the perfume factory where they were working. If Athenagenes had manumitted these slaves himself, the debts would have redounded to him. But if Epicrates became their new owner, however temporarily, the slaves' debts would then become, and did become, the responsibility of Epicrates, hence the lawsuit for fraud that we have preserved. I'd like to turn now to a third way in which a slave might earn her freedom through sexual means, namely in exchange for bringing a child to serve as her replacement. In such cases, it was usually stipulated as one of the conditions of manumission that the baby be handed over to the master or to the master's children once it had been weaned. Essentially, we can think of these babies as a way of reimbursing the master for his financial loss in manumitting the mother. So in a relatively typical example from Delphi, this is handout 3A, two individuals who may be sisters named Trupheron and Smyrna sell, quote-unquote, sell to Apollo their slave Soterica. After stating that Soterica has to remain by their side in Paramone their entire lives, it stipulated, quote, and let Soterica give to Smyrna's son Trophon a 1-year-old baby. And if Soterica wishes to depart before the appointed time from Trupheron and Smyrna, let her give them 3 minas of silver and let her be free, that is, completely free. So what we see here is that handing over a baby is a requirement of her manumission. If she doesn't somehow produce a child, she presumably reverts to being a slave. But even handing over a child is not in itself sufficient to release her from Paramone. To be free from Paramone, she either has to wait for her mistresses to die or provide them with an additional sum of 3 minas. Now, in other instances, a slave is offered a choice between handing over a child and handing over a presumably comparable sum of money during her period of Paramone. So in handout 3B, the slave Trufina is required, as one of the terms of her Paramone, to hand over to Stocte, who's presumably the daughter of her master and mistress, either, quote, 2 minas of silver or a 1-year-old baby. Unlike Soterica in handout 3A, if she wants to be completely free from Paramone to her master and mistress before they die, she has to hand over to them an additional 3 minas. Now finally, a few inscriptions specify that the child to be handed over to the master, that the child be handed over to the master's heir after the master's death. So for example, in handout 3C, the husband and wife pair Apollonius and Olympias, quote unquote, sell their slave Zosima to Apollo on the condition of Paramone. Part of the inscription reads, quote, and whenever Apollonius or Olympia should suffer something, die, let Zosima give to Soteris, their daughter, 3 minas of silver and a 1-year-old baby, and let Zosima be free. That is, Zosima will be completely free, not upon the death of her masters, as is often the case, but only once she has produced a child as her replacement, as well as 3 minas of silver. Now we might compare these Delphic inscriptions to a practice found on the Greek island of Kalymna in the 1st century CE. These slightly later inscriptions record not fictive sales or dedications to the gods, but what appear to be more or less secular manumission. Now, not all of these inscriptions require the handing over of babies, but many of them do. And when they do, there's sometimes a clause stating that the slave can make a monetary payment in lieu of handing over a baby, similar to what we saw in handout 3B. So for example, in one inscription from Kalymna, handout 3D, we read the following. Quote, Diogenes and Alexios freed their own fosterling slave Asiya on the condition that she will remain by them the length of their lives. And she will raise a male 2-year-old little nursling, one for Diogenes, one for Alexios, or will pay to each 50 denarii. So it appears then that Asiya was to be released from Harmone upon the death of her masters, provided that she produce a child for each of them, or hand over an equivalent sum of money. So in this talk, I have demonstrated 3 ways in which sex, and in particular reproductive capacity, could contribute to the manumission of slaves. As we've seen, the cost of freedom for these slaves was quite high. Regardless of why they were freed, most of them were obligated to provide sexual services even after their manumission. Nonetheless, I hope to have shown that even within the constraints of their oppression, there were some ways in which Greek slaves could use their limited resources, in this case their own bodies, to attain a better status, if only a slightly better one. Thank you.
I thought that I would start us off by asking maybe some conceptual issues raised by your papers, because I'm trying to think, your papers are separated, of course, by centuries and all kinds of water bodies. But the protagonists seem surprisingly, I was scribbling away they seem surprisingly familiar to somebody like me who spent a lot of time in the 19th century. And they remind us, I think, that the continuities between past and present, past is never truly past, right? I mean, there are sharp continuities between past and present. And the meaning of freedom, what does freedom really mean, is something that we grapple with to this day. And people all over the world grapple with that idea. But I thought that I would start by asking you a question related to the archives, the problem of agency, and their implications for interpreting the meaning of freedom, right? The way marginalized peoples understand and live out meanings of freedom. In terms of the archives, historians have certainly broadened our conception of the archives quite substantially. To include oral testimonies, the workings of memory, and these are ways to honor enslaved agency, right? To try and tease out the voices of the quote-unquote subaltern. In the context of Greek history, I was wondering, is it possible to make the Greek subaltern speak? It's very clear what the masters wanted, right? Can we ever truly know what these enslaved women wanted? And for Professor, for Sahia, I was wondering, what do you think of the boundaries between literature and history in teasing out?
That's really a rhetorical question.
I think we historians should actually become, we should all become sort of, I don't know, somewhere between, at least those of us who write about protagonists who have been historically invisible, who have been historically inaudible, right? I think literature is our way out. So,
Okay. So, I mean, it's an excellent question. I think those of us who work in the ancient world, one of the things that we're always trying to access is the voice of any marginalized, well, some of us at least, the voice of marginalized communities, whether it be women or slaves or really even the lower classes, none of whom have, unfortunately, a direct voice preserved for us. So we don't have slave narratives. We don't have, one or two female authors, literature, writings preserved. So we're left with, you asked about the archive. For my work, it's looking at these inscriptions, which are essentially legal documents recording the freeing of slaves. One thing, actually, that I didn't mention in this talk, but which is a parallel with your work, actually, is that I was focusing on certain aspects of the inscriptions, but one thing that's always said, almost always said in the inscriptions is, for so-and-so, there's a sale, and these fictive sales for someone to be free, and then there's sort of almost a gloss on what that means. It's in order that she may go wherever she wants to go. I was thinking about your, the idea that the wanderer, and it's like she can go wherever she wants to go, and she can do whatever she wants to do. Almost like an explanatory gloss of what freedom is. So those documents and these court cases, and then literature that has to be read carefully to access. But in terms of accessing the closest, probably maybe fables, because we do have fables, which may be the voice of slaves or at least lower class individuals.
So what did freedom mean for these women? I'll tell you why I ask, because in a lot of Afro-Asian societies, the concept of freedom didn't assume an autonomous self, right? A subject in the Enlightenment sense of the term, right? So freedom is all about access to kinship, to community. As slavery was almost a means of incorporating outsiders into particular kin groups and so on. In the 19th century US, of course, slavery and freedom were constructed in very bipolar ways, and certainly not a spectrum. In a legal sense, it's not a spectrum, right? So what was in it for these women? I did wonder about that.
That's an excellent question. So technically, legally speaking, they are free. So that means, essentially for women, that means the status of their children is determined by that. There's, a slave cannot own anything, but a free person can. So although, I mentioned that slave prostitutes often seem to have pocketed some money from their clients, which they could use towards buying their freedom. Legally speaking, they could not own anything, including money. So being free at least allows for the possibility of owning things. But in practice, what their life looked like probably is not substantially different than a survival existence.
So the archive and literature and history, and I would say my account of Estelle Brown is totally archivally based, but I utilize kind of novelistic techniques in actually telling that story, and in part I do that how do I use this document created by the state? Actually, a prison file and a profile produced by a psychiatric institute, right? To break open that archive so it yields a different kind of story. And so that, for me, is about the kind of, there's always the speculative dimension of history, or if I give you a kind of like a theoretical account of a theoretical description of her movement through the city, vis-a-vis Michel de Certeau, you'll be like, yes. So what is it actually to think about that just in the level of kind of physical and material space to describe that practice? And so that's where I began, and I think that, the kind of entanglement is so marked. And you had a book called From Slavery to Poverty. And I think, with this book, Wayward Lives, I did not want to write another book about slavery. But in fact, I'm reading the literature on the slum, the emergent ghetto, and the kind of absolute kind of economic exclusion that Black people face in the northern city is just incredible. And when we think about the kind of the afterlife of slavery, it looks like slavery and all, but often we have a notion of the chain gang or the convict release system. But as someone like Evolia Glimpf in her House of Bondage, we need to think really about domestic labor, establishing that explicit continuity for Black women, and domestic labor, it had a kind of racial taint. So immigrant, European immigrant women, they didn't want to do that work either. And part of the reason they didn't want to do it, not only because it was hard, but because it was associated, it was tainted by slavery for everyone because of that history. So the paradox is that people are in this space, they're in the city, and over 90% of Black women are still working as domestic laborers. So,
actually, you use images of Maddie and Aunt Jemima to trace some of these, the representations of the Black woman in the white kitchen, and how old ideas about race and femininity and labor are manipulated, by advertisers in the 1920s.
but it also, goes to the kind of to the intimate labor that's also part of these systems of exploitation. Because it is about care,
Sure.
right? It is about the requirement to, take care of, even to love, right? A child who is, your boss or your master. So I think that thinking about the kind of the character of that, violated maternal labor on the one hand, that's part of these histories of slavery and domestic labor, right? And then what it means to refuse that, and why that refusal, is also about a kind of, a radical thought of the otherwise, even if one struggles to make the otherwise happen.
I love the pairing. It's complicated and hard. In the second talk, part of what we're calling novelization does, to me anyway, is give us access, especially the moment right before she gets arrested, to her pleasure, and to freedom's potential relationship to the pleasure of one's body and the pleasure of one's body in space and with sex and just having fun. I find it harder in the case of the first project to think about women's pleasure. And I'm wondering if you could think about how the meager archive that you have access to could ever allow you potentially to imagine the novelization that we see in the second project, to have access to women's pleasure as part of the Project of Freedom.
This is the first time I've ever encountered someone who has an archive that's more meager than
Yeah, it's an excellent question. The nature, not only are the sources limited, but, well, actually I was going to say something that's not true, because the Greeks did think that women experienced pleasure in sex, and sometimes believe that they experienced more pleasure than men did. But there's absolutely nothing, I can't think of any, at least offhand, any other classicists in the audience can let me know if they, yeah. Please.
So it's a really one-off, but it's my favorite piece of evidence. It's from central Italy. It's a roof tile, a clay roof tile, in a religious sanctuary being built at this sort of moment where southern Italy is looking to the Greek world and going, we want some of that, but we're going to do it our way. It's up in the mountains. And so it's never meant to be seen by anyone, and it's got a graffito. And two women put their shoe prints into it, one on either side. And then they sign it, and they sign it in their own languages naming their masters. They're slave women, and one is writing in the indigenous language of her community, Oscan, and the other one is writing Latin. And it is very playful. It's bilingually playful, it's introspectively playful. They are clearly engaged in manual labor, and they're clearly aware of the permanency of the material, but also its sort of time capsule-ness of being up there, being seen. And so it's only really in these bits of graffiti that lets us anywhere into it. But the fact that the women who are making roof tiles in central Italy in the 2nd century BC are literate in 2 different languages and thus technically appear to be bilingual is also pretty cool as a sort of sense of what the slave labor force looks like in this one teeny moment. But I would love to write a story of these 2 women and their labor and how they ended up leaving us their footprints.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I mean there's much less graffiti from Greece than there is from various parts of Italy, especially Pompeii. So that's one place where you can get almost not completely unmediated access, but some voice of women, including I'm thinking of Pompeii especially, sometimes purely women's graffiti talking about sex. So in that case you can perhaps get more of a glimpse.
I want to ask Professor Kamen about your example 2A, right, from Aristophanes. Because I've always read this passage as part of what's, in my opinion, going on here is not just that the father is violating, it's funny because the father's violating social norms by doing something that normally should be the son, but he's also violating social norms because he's promising to free an alatress, right? And that the implication here is that there are women who are sexually available to you who don't get any benefit or potential benefit from this, right? The alatress is at the bottom of the sexual slavery hierarchy. It's okay maybe to free a porne to be your concubine. It's definitely okay to do this with a hetaira. But an alatress, no, you have sex with her and then she just stays a slave.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So an alatress is a flute player. And I think part of what makes this this whole episode so funny is that this guy has no idea how to act at a symposium, this drinking party. So everything he does is wrong, and that's probably part of it, right? Like, yeah, the thing you do at a symposium is you maybe move on the hetaira, but not necessarily. I mean, they are there for sexual use, the flute playing girls. But you're exactly right that that's not the one you would normally want to assist in their manumission. Thank you for that.
I have a question for Dr. Hartman. Your talk reminded me of maybe 7 years ago when I was reading Colored Amazons by Callie Gross. And I remember that book being eye-opening because it made me think back maybe 20 years prior when I was a kid listening to my mother and my aunt. Conversations I wasn't supposed to hear, but I was listening anyway. And I remember a woman that my aunt knew had passed away, and they were kind of recollecting stories about her, someone they knew fairly well, but she was infamous for actually posing as domestic workers going to the north side of Chicago and actually ripping off white families, stealing things that I guess was pretty successful and never ended up in jail. So it was actually a tension of a certain level of admiration on the part of my mother especially, but also a certain level of disdain because they knew I was listening and this idea that crime is bad, and certainly represented a tension that I feel is much broader. It's certainly in the Black community. I guess I was curious about how did you see that tension between the refusal and the respectability, and does the refusal itself have a I guess a political praxis in the way that you're describing it still?
I would say yes. I think, with Caligula, she talks about like the Badger scheme, like, you know, and in a way it's a kind of subversive play because, you know, in 19th century Philadelphia, white men are often mistaking black women for prostitutes on the street. Well, why not pretend to be one and then steal his wallet? And then, you know, it's like that. I mean, I think that for me, I'm definitely trying to say that there's a politics there. I mean, partly it's like, I mean, a way in which I think anarchism is useful as one kind of political lens, as our feminism, what these others, is to kind of think about thought and deed, right? What is the kind of the thought that's, you know, enacted in the world? And one of the things, you know, and Du Bois is always in the back of my, you know, head when I'm doing anything, and part of like the description of the general strike, it is about, you know, this deed, and it, you know, and it takes the thought, which is only his thought, right? Like, you know, 6 decades later, to actually make sense of what that deed, what those deeds, what those, you know, hundreds of thousands of deeds actually amounted to. I mean, no one could imagine that, ever did imagine that as like a general strike before Du Bois had, right? And that's about, and he has an introduction to Black Reconstruction, which is his note to the reader. And in the note to the reader, he says, okay, before you proceed ahead, you have to imagine one thing. You have to imagine that Black people are human. And that's related to the notion of agency too, right? So what kind of action are, you know, certain social actors capable of? So I am thinking about the political valence of refusal, and also wanting to resist quickly assimilating this action into an available political interpretive grid at the same time. So to kind of exist more in that, the space in between.
Thank you both so much for the presentation. I have a question for Professor Hartman. What was most striking to me about the presentation and the conference in general is how different groups have such different conceptualizations of what freedom means, and often at the cost of the freedom of others. And it reminded me of a statement that you made, which Frank Wilderson quoted in an interview I was listening, and it was, the Black Revolution would make everyone more free than they actually want to be. And so I was wondering if you could expand on that. And the second part of that was, which kind of jumps off the first, is what your thoughts are and what implications that has for some of the guiding arguments of Afro-Capitalism, which links slaveness and social debt to Blackness, and is kind of a critique of this idea of Black freedom, because that freedom would be only plausible or possible through, as Frank Wilderson says, a sort of like magnificent violence or overthrow of civil society.
Well, you know, I mean, so this reminds me of the first part, how like kind of, you know, Black freedom or Black revolution would make everybody more free than they want to be. Yeah, and I mean, I think that there are a range of people, whether it's, you know, Frank or Fred Moten or Denise Ferreira de Silva, I mean, or Césaire, you know, I mean, Césaire, I mean, basically, how do we bring a certain kind of like order of man, Sylvia Wynter, to an end, right? And there's a way that the kind of, you know, the very grammar of the human, you know, this has to radically change, and some people talk about that as, you know, a revolution, an end of the world. So something, I mean, it is a kind of, it's a revolutionary horizon, right? It's about wanting to imagine a radically different order. So yes, I mean, I think that, you know, for me, as I said when I started this project, I actually wanted to not think about slavery. That was kind of my intention. Like, okay, let me just, you know, make it a bit more, you know, put a little distance between myself and those terms. But then at a certain point, I was like, wait, you know, involuntary servitude, vagrancy statutes. I was just like, wait, I'm like back to a territory that's, you know, radically familiar, and that's about you know, the continuities with transformation, but of a certain state of unfreedom, right? And that kind of, I mean, Dion Brands has this great line where she says, well, you know, suppose captivity is actually the normative schema, right? As opposed to kind of, you know, and Patterson has this great thing about, you know, are we to esteem slavery for what it has wrought, right? So I'm trying to think about both, you know, that the tension and a kind of, I would say, a radical imagining of the otherwise by those who, like, you know, aren't proper persons, who own nothing, right? Who are so outside of certain norms of liberal individuality and subjectivity, and who really aren't even imagining freedom in those kind of grand terms, right? So, and I think it's interesting at moments in Du Bois and in James when they make that subject into a certain kind of revolutionary subject, and then that subject is much more like, you know, like a Marxist subject or a classic. When I think that there's a complex layering of how we imagine this agency that I think can actually defy certain notions of the subject and need not kind of reinscribe them.
Thank you both for the presentations. My question is for Professor Hartman. So does this wayward wanderer, your conceptualization of it, is there a destination in mind? And if not, could the wandering itself be seen as sort of like an active liberatory practice that's needed in order to be able to navigate all of these different public and private spheres where there's no power and no, like the state is infiltrating every facet of the lives. So like, is the wandering an active practice, or do you, in your mind, have a destination?
You know, the destination is like wildly, you know, utopian, but so I would say yes to everything, you know, that you said, and I'm actually trying to think about what's made in that space. So when I said, you know, to kind of, you know, that survival is about kind of, you know, making life. So it's a social poesis, right? So there is something that's happened. There is something that's made through these practices, and generally, you know, think of them in like a default category, right? So that's what the sociologist does. So what are the forms then of, like, you know, household arrangement? So is it like a broken household that embraces stranger, or is that kind of like a household that actually is a place for the stranger, the Ment, right? So that there's something like in those ways of doing that I think that are enabling, and just even in terms of the wandering, I mean, in terms of the kind of like police scrutiny that we, you know, see focused on a place like Harlem in the 1920s. I mean, there were all these undercover investigators because the Committee of 14, I mean, they're literally trying to impose, like, to segregate social space, right? And so they you know, hire, you know, black undercover investigators too, and so they have a list of like all of these, you know, people that they're going to arrest in all these apartments. And the thing is that because people move around so much, that by the time the police go to those addresses, like usually 50% of the people have already moved. So it's not, so people are also moving for a reason, and part of it is to kind of elude the law, because there is an understanding that, you know, we are being watched, and that the notion of a kind of a private space is so very elusive, right? That the kind of the black interior is this kind of precarious space. But yeah, there's definitely a making that's happening there. I mean, Sylvia Wynter talks about this in terms of these like other glimpses of sociality.
We have a lot of questions. Should we move to this part? Starting with you.
I was a Professor Hartman. I was thinking about anti-archdiocesca, like Salme of the tenements, and you have mentioned like the tension perhaps that exists between the voices of the immigrant, of the woman immigrant coming into the United States and having to negotiate as well those laws. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that tension. I mean, your siesta seems to be also kind of rebelling, if you will, against the fact that the state has to impose on her to speak English, and she doesn't really like her ESL classes and all of that, but for certain it's not this radical voice. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the relationship between the immigrant women and voices like Estelle Brown.
No, I mean, it's interesting because in a way it almost goes back to your question. And I think partly with the immigrant women, citizenship is still a kind of horizon. And I think that, citizenship it's just a very fraught category for Black folks, right? So that we see that there's this normalizing project, and we see it also in settlement houses that serve Jewish community and Black community, or Black community and the Italian community. I mean, basically, progressive reformers are the architects of racial segregation, because even where they're having a sewing class or wood making class, they then have to kind of institute a separate class for Negro boys from the Jewish boys or from the Italian boys. So I think that there's a way in which there's a sense that there's a kind of, there's a white citizen project that's her horizon of possibility. Whereas, I mean, New York State, the state legislature, they're trying to pass anti-miscegenation laws in 1920s, right? I mean, so that kind of the particularity of an anti-Black racism is so marked, and I think that in trying to track this movement from the slum to the ghetto, what is interesting is that you see at a certain point, I mean, you have people who are living in a kind of interracial slum, right? And that slum, though, that's part of the crisis of that slum, that you have then these people who are not yet conscripted to a certain kind of, racialized citizen project, who are living side by side with Negroes. So there's also an attempt to, to punish them. So often, some of the kind of the cases of Jewish or Italian young women who I come across, I mean, they come across my path because they've actually, been involved. They've had Black girlfriends, they've had a Black man as a lover, they want to marry a Negro, so they get kind of caught up in a criminalizing system for also not being a part of a certain project.
Actually, this is a perfect follow-up to that in terms of the carceral state and how efficient it is. You mentioned the progressive, sort of the good government types, and they're so much in opposition to Tammany Hall in New York. Is Tammany functioning as an immigrant group? I mean, certainly that Irish thing, that's so fraught and weird, or is that part of the sort of immigrant resistance? I mean, I know there's been recent stuff about sort of Tammany being rehabilitated as kind of a immigrant resistance group, but I'm not sure I buy it completely. I've seen tweet, I've been signed, but yeah.
I mean, that's a really good question, and it's a very hard one. It's a very hard one because what you have is a kind of corruption coupled with a deep racism in Tammany Hall, and so much of the way that the phenomenon of urban riot is articulated is often the kind of these kind of clashes between Black folks and other kind of white ethnic immigrant. And so the 1900 riot, the kind of the police, I mean, is a huge force. It's a largely Irish force, in terms of anti-Black violence. So we can't say okay, there's some easy working class solidarity, and then there's also the paradox, because even Du Bois going to why is he in Philadelphia? Because the Black folks have voted for the wrong guy. They voted for the the corrupt Democrat when they should have voted for the progressive candidate. And even though the ladies at the college settlement have been there for 20 years, they have utterly no traction in the Black community, right? So that we have these really, differently arrayed forces, but who have some, troubling commonality, right? So one is about a project which is ultimately about an uplift project in terms of settlement and social reformers, but its commitment to certain fundamental tenets of kind of racialization, social segregation, and the legislation of the social is deeply problematic.
And in fact, in the South, segregation is being rationalized as a progressive measure, purification of politics. Get rid of political corruption by eliminating the Negro vote altogether.
And it's also interesting about that dialogue between the North and the South because, it was on the headline of every Southern newspaper, the 1900 race riot, because it was like, thank you, North. Show yourself to be that you're as racist as we are. And again, this is something Du Bois talks about: is that relationship between Northern capital and the South. And so many the people who sign on to this Tuskegee project, they're Northern philanthropists. I mean, they are the children of these people. So Louis Manon has a different answer to these sets of issues, but it's it's definitely a troubling entanglement.
Okay, so where do we travel now? Did you have, I think we had, I think you had your hands raised and we had a hand raised, I think on the far side, you had a hand raised too.
So going back to the commonalities of both talks, so the state is very important in both cases, whether in sort of the role of ensuring that these contracts about ammunition are actually met, and then on the other hand, policing these women. But Dr. Kamen's talk, you have lots of different states at different times. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about how slavery fits into these different forms of Greek states, and then so going back to America, what changes within the American state are going on at this time that sort of is causing this eruption in police, or not necessarily eruption, but this sort of like bureaucratization of policing that's quite different than, say, the 19th century.
Okay, so right, the question of the state's involvement is also something I didn't draw up, but thank you for mentioning that, because a lot of these contracts do explicitly otherwise. Sometimes it's just it's sale, it's done in accordance with the laws of the city, or sometimes the city's council is mentioned to have it or something like that. But it is within the context of each city-state. The question, actually, it's a real difficult one to answer. What happens if a manumission takes place in one city-state, like Delphi? So you can notice most of these inscriptions are from Delphi, just because there's thousands of inscriptions there, but they're not all slaves from that city. So do they go back home to their home cities? And presumably there's no international or even national law, since there's no nation of Greece at this time. How that's upheld in other city-states is an open question. But presumably if you have a record saying that the manumission took place, if you have a record, it would be upheld in another polis. Every, different city-states would have different procedures. I mean, these change both geographically and temporally. So there's certain kind of slaves who are freed more often than others. I'm not sure if you have any particular ideas in mind, or.
Yes, Delphi is just very odd.
Yeah.
There's this hub of these surrounding polis where people just go to manumit their slaves. And so obviously Apollo is important, but why? Yeah, like you said, it's an open question. I just haven't come across any.
Yeah, I mean, it's this one city is it's thought of as the Greeks themselves thought of it as kind of the navel of the earth. And it's a place that is a Pan-Hellenic, old Greek sanctuary. It's where games were put on for all Greeks. And so we're a kind of hub for all, various kinds of traffic. And so I think that's part of it. Just a lot of people are going to this place. And then once the practice began, you've got a nice wall that has these inscriptions on it. People just continue doing it. But I think it's a place with a god who, for various reasons, seems to be a favored god in the mission. This is one of his homes, but one of his most prominent homes. So that draws people there, even if that's not their city.
I have a question.
I think that, there's a couple of answers. One, there's a book called Disturbing the Peace where Brian Wagner talks about, the birth of the modern police in the U.S. and Atlanta as a particular response to the problem of Black freedom. That's what the modern police is there to do. In terms of, thinking about the state, what's interesting, and David Rothman speaks of this in his classic book. What is the title of that book on the side? Here's the book. It's a book that's basically on, but it's a therapeutic state. It's a state where actually kind of many feminists and progressives have access to state power, and ironically, prostitution, what, kind of feminists and progressive reformers want to do, they want to solve the problem of prostitution, and how they want to solve it is by saying, no more 60 days at the workhouse, that doesn't work. Let's sentence these girls to 3 years at a reformatory so that they actually come up with answers that are actually much more devastating and much more punitive. So those actors are building policy. I think what's interesting about New York is that you have these non-state actors who have so much power in deciding what happens in the cities. So basically looking at the way in which the police are, the handmaidens of the Committee of 14, and the way they can impose policy through economic pressure, through real estate, through licensing, to control forms of sociality and engagement. So there's both state actors and non-state actors, but what's supposed to be, again, it's not these draconian measures which actually result in their arrest. It's actually all of these, it's more Foucauldian. It's an attempt to kind of produce a certain kind of subject. It's a kind of beneficial and reform regime which actually results in these kind of criminal disparities.